This might be the most important speech in video game history. Infamously entitled the Dragon Speech, it was given by Chris Crawford, a game developer who has been around the medium since its earliest days, and who also happens to be the founder of GDC. I urge you all to watch it in its entirety, but here is, in my humble estimation, the most important part.
I dreamed of the day when computer games would be a viable medium of artistic expression, an art form. I dreamed of computer games encompassing the broad range of human experience and emotion. Computer games about tragedy or self-sacrifice, games about duty and honor, patriotism, satirical games about politics, or games about human folly, games about man's relationship to God or to nature, games about the passionate love between a boy and a girl, or the serene and mature love between husband and wife of decades. Games about family relationships or death, mortality, a boy becoming a man or a man realizing he is no longer young. Games about a man facing truth at high noon on a dusty main street, or a boy and his dog, or a prostitute with a heart of gold. All of these things and more were part of this dream, but by themselves, they amounted to nothing.
What was brilliant about this speech was not only its wide-ranging content, its impassioned delivery, or the animated interludes that border on performance art, but its stunning prescience about the medium today. He anticipated our continued obsession with graphics and technology, an aversion or inability to devise storytelling verbs and deeper thematic content, and a medium fragmented by its desire to expand to a broader audience, yet satisfy the appetites of an insatiable hardcore. At the end of the talk, Chris unsheaths a sword, one which I am not entirely sure was real or not, and charges out the room to slay the proverbial dragons of our medium, much to the consternation and amusement of an audience who would go on to mostly ignore the advice of this gyrating scholar. Regardless, the Game Developers Conference is held every year, and every year the best thinkers and developers in the industry converge to discuss new ideas, share tech, or simply meet their fellow colleagues. GDC has a YouTube channel that anyone interested in games should subscribe to now, but it doesn't have nearly as much traction as it deserves. If you're wondering what this video is about, I thought it would be interesting to document some of the best ideas I've heard in all these talks, and how they either relate to, rebut, or address the issues Chris laid out in that speech of his. Are we any closer to slaying his dragons, or is this just a fool's errand? Fool is what the word fun supposedly comes from, and that is part of the title of Raph Koster's seminal book, A Theory of Fun. In it, he describes how fun is the ability for a system to provide a possibility space that enables cognitive and social learning. For example, tic-tac-toe, as a simple game with a dominant solution, is less fun than Go, an absurdly deep game that throws out more configurations than there are stars in the universe. In Crawford's speech, he laments how a reviewer once called a game of his great, but lacking in fun, which he replied with how Beethoven and Shakespeare would feel if their works were called unfun. In any case, this talk by Koster entitled Practical Creativity is a meditation on another one of Chris's points. How can we actually be creative in a medium that seems insistent on making the same thing? Koster points out how creativity doesn't come from nowhere. It is the merging of existing elements in interesting ways that births new things. He suggests we take a pattern in one context and apply it in another. For example, how Mega Man extracted the platforming verb and applied it to shooters, effectively combining Donkey Kong and Space Invaders. Or think of a die. It can be thought of as a probability device, a hit point designator, a timer, a state machine, or my favorite, an actual physical building block in the game Blueprint. Next, why not add a dimension? Donkey Kong was on a flat screen, then Mario added scrolling, and then of course we jumped to 3D. This progression can be seen in most games, which led Koster to say,
"There have only been 5 fighting games in history."
Another suggestion includes forcing a constraint, like having a platformer without a jump. Verbs can also merge, like the game Burnout, which combines action verbs with driving verbs to allow you to do takedowns when you slam into opponents. Or you can just fuse genres together, like how Deus Ex is an RPG and first-person game, or how Rez is an on-rail shooter and music game. Finally, he suggests we start with an emotion or theme, like love, and figure out how to convey this through mechanics. This ties directly into what Chris was talking about, and is something Jonathan Blow has spoken about too. For example, Blow's game Braid uses some interesting time manipulation mechanics, so the game's narrative themes are about regret, change, and redemption. Eco starts with the idea of love, and then builds its mechanics around this. It makes you hold down a button to simulate intimacy, solve cooperative puzzles to heighten a sense of dependency with your companion Yorda, and strips away your health bar to force you to care more for your companion than yourself, systemizing selflessness. We can either start with an idea or theme, or we can examine what themes are conveyed by our mechanics. Let's get to some other talks though. In her talk, Precision of Emotion, Erin Hofstadter reinforces some of these points by arguing that fun is a general mechanism for enabling learning, but her twist on this is that it should be expanded to broader thematic content as well, reconciling Koster and Crawford in some sense. She outlines how a game like Papers, Please uses the emotion of complicity, where the player feels guilt and dissonance for having to choose between the right thing to do and their selfish desires, to teach about the encroachment of bureaucracy on humanity, or how Journey systemizes the hero's journey to teach us about the embedded cultural motifs of humanity. The possibility space that Koster spoke about can be conceptualized as one that is mediated by a whole range of thematic ideas, allowing us to expand the definition of fun. How do we conceptualize this in the context of gameplay though? This is where Haggis' talk, Storytelling Tools, comes in. He argues that even the most abstract games have a plot, and if we understand this general structure, we can apply it to thematic games as well. For example, Tetris has an external goal, an increasing sense of speed and tension, and an internal drive motivated by order and a psychological need for success. This is ultimately an implicit plot that can be mapped onto any number of story templates. The first time this was discovered was when a bug in Space Invaders created an escalating sense of tension that actually mapped onto a framework called flow, where a challenge and a player's abilities rise proportionate to one another to keep a player engaged. Some games use dynamic difficulty, others use AI directors, but ultimately, narrative structure is about the management of tension, whatever the emotion is used to drive it. Let's switch to something else Chris pointed out in his lecture, which is that games are ultimately about communication.
Our minds are not passive receptacles, they are active agents. It's not as if we have a button on the side of our head, and they come along and push the button, and the top of our head flips open, and then they take a pitcher full of knowledge and pour it into our skull. And then they close the top of our head and shake well and say, "Congratulations, you're educated now."
Language is an efficient method of communication, as we can relay things to dozens simultaneously, but is less effective because people aren't given hands-on experience. Children learn by interacting and playing, which is why interactivity is so important. This is an idea echoed in James Gee's book, What Games Teach Us About Learning, and Peter Gray's brilliant book, Free to Learn. In any case, this leads us to this talk by the psychologist Scott Rigby, entitled The Freedom Fallacy, where he tries to address why we play the games we play. Most of you will have heard of the aesthetics of play model by now, which suggests we play to fulfill desires for fantasy, narrative, challenge, competition, escapism, or cooperation. But this talk is talking about having a more sound psychological basis for these claims. He says the reason we play games is to fulfill the desire for relatedness, autonomy, and competence, and these are part of a framework known as self-determination theory. Competence is the idea you are getting better at what you are doing, mapping onto the flow thing we talked about earlier. Relatedness is knowing where you stand in a social network and having a role you can define and act out. And autonomy is not what you think it is. I'll let him explain.
And volition isn't independence or freedom to do whatever you want. Volition is wanting to do the things that you are doing, right?
Feeling autonomy is not about freedom, but engagement and voluntary acceptance. In his mind, this destroys the arbitrary division between open world and linear games we have created in the past, and lets us conceptualize games as fulfilling needs. He then goes on to give fascinating examples of games that fulfill different kinds of needs. GTA allows us to do a whole host of things, but it doesn't allow us to define who we are, so it is superficial in its engagement. Skyrim allows us to take on roles and quests at our leisure, forging our unique identity and fulfilling relatedness, but we cannot actually impact the world. Mass Effect gave us the promise of changing the world, but then of course its ending happened, ruining the illusion, which is what he explains as the reason for the backlash towards the game. A game like The Witcher tried to straddle these two lines, giving multiple endings and so holding on to some semblance of agency. Players are consumed by these worlds because they fulfill these basic psychological needs, which is why they feel affronted when the illusion breaks down. Interestingly, Rigby thinks the reason games like No Man's Sky and Star Citizen are as appealing as they are is precisely this, and why they are bound to disappoint. Ultimately, he suggests we think about designing for needs fulfillment and developing procedural content that creates narrative and meaning, like Shadow of Mordor's drama-creating Nemesis system. Again, emphasizing the need for breadth and thematic relevance over a linear scale of fun. Another important talk that emphasizes the importance of self-determination theory is Meaningful Choice by Matthias Worch. However, he is talking about it in a more moment-to-moment sense. He uses Doom to explain a concept called orthogonal unit differentiation, which is just a fancy way of saying having clear distinct enemies who all serve a particular purpose. In Doom, all enemies fall within a 2D axis between projectile weapons and hit scan, and ranged and melee attacks, and every enemy type fits somewhere along the spectrum. What's brilliant about this is that it forces the player to make prioritization decisions like, who should I shoot first, where do I move, and how vulnerable am I with specific configurations, and it allows designers to create infinite permutations of decisions using combinations of elements. He argues games like Dead Space and Halo use this framework, but we can see it elsewhere. Shoot-em-ups like Geometry Wars have a variety of enemies to create priority puzzles, and a hack-and-slash game like Devil May Cry also has clear enemy archetypes along a slightly different spectrum that enables meaningful choice in a fast, frantic, and linear play space. Again, the division between linear and open is less relevant than the ability for choices to fulfill a player's core psychological drives. Superficially, these choices are what we often mean by deep games, and this is something Chris Crawford spoke about as well.
These people, boy, it's easy to figure out what they want. And what do they want? They want more depth. Yeah, they've invested a lot of money and a lot of time climbing that ladder. And they don't want to throw away that investment. They don't want to start all over on a new ladder. They want to keep climbing the ladder. They want to go higher and higher. They want more depth in their games. And think about how that compares to my dream. Because I want to encompass the broad range of human experience and emotion. What I want is breadth. And what the customers want is depth.
Regardless of his reservations about our obsessive pursuit of depth, we have become masters as a medium when it comes to delivering this. This is where the next talk, Sid Meier's Interesting Decisions, comes in. Sid Meier famously said that a game was just a series of interesting decisions, and in this talk, he expands a little on how. He talks about risk versus reward decisions, which can be seen in everything from Tetris, where you can either build up at the risk of stacking too high, or just clear lines relatively risk-free, to how Mario Kart allows you to use manual versus automatic. Immersive sims create options between stealth and action that have varying levels of risk and difficulty. The other type he talks about are long-term decisions versus short-term decisions, seen in his Civilization games, where you have to choose between attacking now or later and balancing different resource systems in a precarious tangle of distributed decision-making. However, we can actually tie this back to something Koster said in his talk, when he said all fighting games are like rock, paper, scissors. The reality is that most games fall into a few strategic non-Nash equilibrium games, something outlined in the book Designing Games by Tynan Sylvester. In fighting games, it is throw beats block, block beats punches, and punches beat throws, but this structure is seen in real-time strategy games and Battlefield's multiplayer as well. Another type of dynamic is called the matching pennies dynamic, which is present in penalty kicks in soccer, where two sides are trying to guess one another's play. A Call of Duty bout where you are trying to outsmart your opponent to protect an objective, and even a unit configuration in StarCraft leverages this. However, the reality of lies, information deficits, and mixed strategies makes another dynamic, Yomi, emerge from this strategic strata, making multiplayer games predominantly about reading your opponent, manipulating the information stream, or simply executing better than they do. Games are an emergent blend of OUD, risk-reward, short-term, long-term, rock-paper-scissors, matching pennies, Yomi, and a few other game-theoretic configurations that transpire across a carefully calibrated emergent game space with dynamic repercussions. Dynamism is the name of the game when it comes to Will Wright, the creator of SimCity, and in his talk, Dynamics for Game Designers, he presents a framework for how designers need to start thinking about their games in the context of a series of interconnected systems. To take a slight detour into another talk to explain this, systemic design is when you have a bunch of systems in your world that have built-in logic and sensors that allow them to interact with each other. In this talk describing Zelda Breath of the Wild's design, the director shows how the rule, climbing any object, and the ability, stasis, which allows you to freeze any object and propel it, leads to this emergent outcome. They also describe a chemistry system, but you can go watch the rest in your own time. Back to Will Wright though. He explains how his admittedly obtuse framework can help conceptualize systems. He talks about thinking in vertical layers, and he gives the example of how layers in SimCity actually encoded the value of urban decay. However, vertical layers can be seen in the Battlefield games, where individuals, squads, and teams all cooperate, or in RTS where individual units have distinct AI, but a group has an emergent layer that has its own predefined methods. He also talks about horizontal propagation, otherwise known as feedback loops, and how they affect games. Call of Duty's win streaks actually amplifies the victor's abilities, pushing the game further towards imbalance, whereas rubber banding in a racing game makes sure everyone stays within range of one another. The important thing to do with emergence is to create meaningful play out of it, as we learned earlier, and this is where the talk entitled Holistic Level Design comes in. To embolden players to play with systems, there must be a set of precise and predictable systems that players can see and anticipate in order to have agency in the world. He calls this intentionality, and is an extremely useful concept to keep in mind. He talks about Don Norman's idea about affordances, and how objects in the world need to signify their own function to teach players. This can be seen in Mario's first level, where starting on the left of the screen signifies you had to go right, and the angry eyes of the Goomba, the coins, and the mushrooms all taught players what to do without explicit instruction. He also talks about aligning the player with the avatar, like how Half-Life gets you to care about resisting guards because they mistreat you, the player. Acting with intentionality doesn't just exist within the context of gameplay, but also the narrative, and so systems-driven narrative games can learn a lot from emergent design when it comes to allowing players to create their own narratives. Are you tired yet? Let me throw out a few talks in succession to quicken the pacing here. Death to the 3-act structure is a fascinating insight into how games should try to come up with new story structures suited for our medium, and not just be stuck with those from the past. Uncharted is a 3-act structure, The Last of Us a seasonal configuration, but Fallout looks like this. If we are to solve the dynamic narrative conundrum, we are going to have to figure this out. In his talk Engines of Play, this awesome bearded dude, Jason Vandenberg, outlines the importance of understanding player psychology when it comes to crafting games, and he leverages the Big Five model, which characterizes people according to openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, to calibrate games to a specific audience. He shows how games like Minecraft enable a broader variety of playstyles, explaining its popularity, whereas something like the Stanley Parable goes for a specific niche audience. He claims we need to be precise about where we are targeting, and if you are going for a particular niche, you need to make sure you are one of the best in delivering for that kind of personality, or you risk floundering in the market. On the subject of game feel, there are a few talks you can watch, including this one by Vlambeer, The Art of Screenshake, or Juice It and Lose It by Martin Jonassen. You can also read Steve Swink's comprehensive book, Game Feel. Add bass, add screenshake, add muzzle flash, add squash and stretch, dynamic music, more enemies with less HP, slow motion at critical points, dynamic power-up systems like in SSX, Devil May Cry, or Pac-Man. Add a visceral context and keep amplifying your inputs-outputs, and you are well on your way to imbibing the lessons of all these developers. On the subject of how we start tackling the storytelling dragon, Chris Crawford said this.
If we want real characters in our games, there are 3 fundamental technological hurdles that we must jump. First, the technology of human facial expression. We've got to be able to show people's faces emoting. We've got to show our characters laughing and smiling and crying, looking frightened and skeptical and suspicious and greedy and lustful and romantic. We've got to have a library of 100 different facial expressions, each of which can be put onto the face of any member of our cast. You can't do that yet, can you? I can. I have. The second thing we need is artificial personality. The algorithms of human behavior. We need equations that show how people feel, how they behave, how they react to different situations. And we need this on a gigantic scale. We need to be able to handle hundreds upon hundreds of different behaviors with thousands of different equations. You can't do that yet, can you? I have. And lastly, we need a language of emotional expression. We need to allow our players to interact with the characters in an emotionally significant fashion. It's not good enough to be able to stab them or shoot them or take something away from them or give something to them or talk to them about where the princess is. That's not good enough. We've got to be able to talk about feelings and emotionally significant events. You can't do that yet, can you? Yes, I have.
Interactive storytelling is something of a holy grail, or false idol in gaming, depending on who you ask, and we are still at a rudimentary stage when it comes to developing these systems. Interactivity does not mean having Uncharted cinematic aspirations, the branching levels in The Walking Dead, or false choices in Mass Effect, but having the game respond to the player's input to create dynamic stories. This can be seen in a limited capacity in games like Facade, which has a narrative director in the background, or Alien Isolation, which has its own AI director to control the behavior of its titular antagonist. But have there been people trying to address these issues since? In his talk, The Future of Storytelling, Jesse Schnell outlines how we as a medium are going to have to develop what he calls head verbs if we are in any way going to tell stories about people in games. Schnell, who happens to be the author of the book The Art of Video Game Design, an exceptional book, argues for 3 ways this might happen. We used to have games like Zork that recognized a broader array of text inputs than games today, but somewhere along the line we gave that up for graphical fidelity. He also argues for incorporating technology that does facial recognition, meaning our faces literally become verbs in a new gaming interface, and we already see this with things like Connect. Finally, we can leverage speech recognition software that is fairly pervasive these days. Think about the relative sophistication of Siri and Alexa, and how much nuance your voice can convey. He cites the fake, but stimulating image of Milo as a potential example of this in the future, where we start to interact with entities as if they were real, they start to recognize us as such, and the worlds we inhabit become that much more immersive because of it. However, as we get sucked into the holodeck further and further, we are going to need to resolve the strange identity dissonance between us and our avatar, and this talk, entitled The Identity Bubble, is an attempt to resolve that. The dreaded term ludonarrative dissonance crops up here, which is when there is a disconnect between gameplay and story, or avatar and story, or avatar and player, or player's intention and avatar, or game world and our intended avatar alignment. The real problem with the term, which was coined by Clint Hawking when he was talking about the dissonance inherent in Bioshock's mechanics and story, is that it refers to at least 10 different things. In this talk, Matthias Worch gives us some interesting tools to try and resolve the divide between gameplay and story. First, you can choose between having an avatar, something we inhabit, or an actual character, which functions more like a relationship between player and character. One thing you can do is try to align the states of the characters with yours, for example in the beginning of Uncharted 2, where Drake is confused and disoriented, just like we happen to be. Another is to only make the character do things they would do in their fiction, to make sure you preserve the suspension of disbelief. You can also play up the dissonance to tell a story about how the character's motives are not actually yours, something The Last of Us and Shadow of the Colossus did brilliantly, but I won't spoil that. There are so many issues when it comes to resolving the fact that we are ghosts in the machine in these games. In any case, creating dynamic story structures requires that we understand the power of modular storytelling and the mathematics of stories, 2 topics addressed in the seminal books Hamlet on the Holodeck by Janet Murray and Chris Crawford's own Interactive Storytelling. Modular stories have been used by everyone from ancient Homeric bards to modern-day wrestlers, and is about understanding the subunits of stories to create emergent narrative. In his talk, Narrative Legos, Ken Levine tries to outline what he thinks this vision will entail by explaining how actions in the world by the player need to be recognized by the world and incorporated into its fiction. This can be the alignment of characters, the state of villages, or even the course of a story. Detroit Become Human, Infamous, Demon Souls, The Witcher, Dwarf Fortress, RimWorld, XCOM, and many others have all featured this in some sense, but they are systems that are either very restricted or defined, or way too emergent and complex to seem meaningful. The reality is we are going to have to develop systems, directors, and procedural tools to actually realize this vision, and who knows when this might happen. My favorite way to explain the maths of stories comes from The Witcher, so minor spoilers here. If you romance both of the ladies available in the game, a cutscene plays where both of them screw you over, and not in the good way. The math here is something like if X and Y, where X is romance Triss and Y is romance Yen, then Z, and Z is you are utterly and completely screwed. Interestingly, this algorithmic drama manager is actually encoding the value monogamy into its logic, a reminder that even systems convey values of some kind. On this note, I would recommend Jonathan Blow's talk, The Main Conflicts in Modern Game Design, where he outlines how interactive storytelling, the problem with difficulty, and ludonarrative dissonance are what are holding us back from becoming a truly transformative medium for artistic expression. Crawford understood how one of the main issues with convincing developers to pursue more innovative avenues in video game design was the dynamics of the market, where casual players want more story-based games, and hardcore gamers were much more mechanically inclined, and we see this somewhat in how experiences snidely called walking simulators were initially dismissed by many in the gaming hardcore. In his talk entitled The Play of Stillness, Brian Upton tries to resolve this divide by showing us how the line between a game and a player is not as clear as many may think, as most of what constitutes play takes place in a player's head. Where is the interactivity between 2 turns of a chess game? Well, It's happening in a Yomi-mediated decision tree in the recesses of both players' minds, which he calls anticipatory play. Similarly, he argues games like PT leverage something called interpretive play, where the active play comes from the ambiguity of the story and figuring out what the hell is going on. Ambiguous and symbolic games like Little Nightmares, Inside, and Limbo all leverage this form of play, and it's an understanding again that the divide between gameplay and story is not as discrete as many may think. Further on this topic, the talk Creating Atmosphere in Games by Greg Kasavin tells us that to create immersive worlds, you need a tonal and thematic cohesion that never suspends the disbelief of your game, and this extends to using a thematic interface, diegetic sound, and relevant story cues as well. In this talk, Crafting Existential Dread, the developer of Soma argues we need to be striving for something he calls presence, where the illusion that we are entrapped in an alternate world is preserved. He argues we need mechanics, puzzle design, and ambiguous morality systems to all be embedded in the themes of the universe we are creating, if we want to preserve the sense of enchantment. Ultimately, all these thinkers are confirming the idea that play, story, and gameplay are fundamentally intertwined. There are still so many talks I would be remiss for not mentioning, so I'm going to go through them quickly. The talk Luck and Skill in Games gives us an invaluable framework for conceptualizing the use of uncertainty in games, and how randomness does not necessarily make your game worse. Poker is enhanced by its invocation of uncertainty, and games like Catan are made more accessible because of it. On this topic, I would recommend the book Characteristics of Games, but also Greg Kostikian's Uncertainty in Games. If you want to understand how systems can be used to enhance gameplay, I would recommend Doom's multiple talks on AI and sound design, where they use something called push-forward combat to keep the momentum and dynamism flowing. The post-mortem on Res by Tetsuya Mizuguchi is a great insight into that game's dynamic music, and the talk about the AI in Bioshock Infinite shows you glimpses of how we can infuse AI design into interactive storytelling. The talk 10 Level Design Secrets gives a list of great fundamentals about level design, and the talk Game Design is like a magic trick shows us how there are always systems in the backend that are calibrating a player's experience in accordance with certain gameplay goals. There are also talks by Miyamoto and the Design of Fun, Yoko Taro and Designing Games Backwards, and a whole host of other industry icons I will list in the description below that you should check out. So what will it take to slay Chris Crawford's dragons? We've examined ways developers are trying to infuse more narrative breadth, and we've also seen how far we've come in providing more gameplay depth. But to truly slay the dragon, we are going to have to combine these two somehow. Games are fundamentally play, but play is very often art, so thinking of the two as mutually exclusive is perhaps misguided. We stand on the precipice of creating revolutionary new ways of engaging, teaching, and communicating ideas to players. But for this to happen, both game designers and consumers are going to have to familiarize themselves with all these ideas. Games are a new way of seeing the world, and video games are the latest interface that is mediating that transformation. However, I think it's only fair I give Chris Crawford the last word, so thank you for watching, subscribe if you want more content like this, and I'll see you all next time.
There he is, right in front of me, as clear as day. I never thought that I would see you this clearly. I always saw you in brief glimpses in the dark, but now, you're so much bigger than I'd ever imagined. And I'm not so sure I like this. I mean, yes, you're glorious and beautiful, but you're ugly too. Your breath reeks of death. No, I never had any childish fantasies of conquering you. That thinking is for children. You are beyond that. Indeed, I can see stretched around your feet the bodies of my predecessors, and all you have to show for it is a few nicks and scratches. But do you have to laugh at me that way? Am I so pitiful that you can sneer in my face like that? Yes, you frighten me. You hurt me. I felt your claws ripping through my soul. But I'm going to die someday, and before I can do that, I've got to face you, eyeball to eyeball. I've got to look you right in the eye and see what's inside. But I'm not good enough to do that yet. I'm not experienced enough. So I'm going to have to start learning. Today. Here. Now. Come, dragon. I will fight you. Sancho Panza.